Yuval. We're very, very pleased to have you with us today. As you can see, we have a large group of former students of Ukrainian Leadership Academy, current students of Ukrainian Leadership Academy, and we're also transmitting this talk today via YouTube, and we expect that there will be a significant number of young people that will be applying to Ukrainian Leadership Academy for next year. As you know, my dear friends, as you know, Yuval is a historian. I would even say, perhaps, I would introduce him as a bit of a philosopher, certainly a best-selling author of books. Many of you have read these books: *Sapiens*, *Homo Deus*, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. These are all, I would say, bestsellers that many of them have been translated into Ukrainian and are very widely read. Yuval, we're very pleased to have you with us today. As you know, we're in a difficult situation in our country. Many of us are looking at this as being perhaps a bit of a harbinger, a bit of a signal that things that are happening in Ukraine might have larger civilizational consequences. Certainly, we would be very interested in hearing your opinions and your thoughts on the conflict in Ukraine, which is the largest conflict in Europe since World War II. And in fact, what has changed in terms of history, civilizations? Are we in fact just in a regional war that happens once in a while, or is this something that has more civilizational significance? What do you think?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I've been watching very closely the event in Ukraine, and I think that, no, this is not just a regional or a local war. This Ukraine is now at the forefront of the fight for freedom worldwide, and what happens in Ukraine will have impact throughout the world. One way to look at it is that the global order that has been built for generations and that created the most peaceful and prosperous era in human history, it's now in danger. You know, since 1945, it didn't happen even once that a country with wide international recognition was simply destroyed or wiped off the map by external invasion. Saddam Hussein tried to do it to Kuwait and failed, was expelled. And this is remarkable because for most of history, this was standard. You know, all the big empires, whether Mongols or Ottoman Turks or Tsars, this is what they do all the time. They invade countries and destroy them and conquer them. And this stopped. And it changed, you know, our entire mentality. Just think about the fact that for most of history, the biggest item on the budget of every king, every Tsar, every emperor, every sultan was the military. They spent most of their money on fortresses and armies and navies and things like that. In recent decades, in the early 21st century, the average expenditure of a government on military, I'm talking about the whole world, not just Western Europe, the whole world, the average is about 6%. They spend much more on education, on healthcare, on welfare. The world that we live in, people all over the world, is made possible by the era of relative peace of the last few decades. Now, it was not complete peace. I live in the Middle East. I know perfectly well there are still violence, there are still conflicts, but the type of conflicts that we saw before 1945, they were very different. And everything now is in jeopardy because Putin has broken the biggest taboo of the international order, of the global system. He is trying to really destroy a country, to destroy a nation. And if he succeeds, then, you know, dictators and military regimes all over the world are watching to see what happens. If he succeeds, we will see more and more Putins popping up in different parts of the world. The era of peace will be over. Also the era of prosperity. Because countries everywhere, not just in Europe, will be forced to double and triple their defense expenditure. We already saw not just Germany, but also Japan talking about doubling its defense budget. And it's a race to the bottom. If one country doubles its defense budget, the neighbors become frightened. They also do the same thing. So instead of financing teachers and nurses and social workers, more and more of the world would look like Russia, spending its money on tanks and missiles and cyber weapons. So it's not just in the interest of Ukrainians or in the interests of the immediate neighbors of Russia and Ukraine that we should all hope that Putin fails. It's in the interest, really, of every human being on earth.
Yuval, you might notice that many of the people that are listening to you today are dressed, as I am, in an embroidered shirt. Today is a sort of an informal national holiday in Ukraine, where we call it Vyshyvanka Day. So we get dressed in the traditional embroidered shirts and costumes, and also very, very often modernized into a little bit more of a sort of an everyday life. Yes, we have students that want to show off a little bit.
Actually, I also have a shirt like this. I was in Kiev in 2019, and I got as a present one of these shirts. I didn't know that it's today, but maybe I would have dressed up. But it's
no problem.
Too late for that.
The reason this was actually a bit of a lead up to a question. Ukrainians are very proud of their heritage, and one of the things that Putin, the reason for Putin's attack, if we look at things very in terms of what he's saying, analyzing his discourse and his actions, the actions of the Russian people are the Russian army is to basically say that the Ukrainian nation has no right to exist.
Yeah.
And that the Ukrainian nation is in fact a part of the Russian nation. Now, I'm going to be a little bit provocative because in one of your books, you in fact state that the concept of nation is artificial and should never be valued higher than human life. But patriotism is in fact the mobilizing force at the moment in Ukraine. And it's the reason that many would say Ukrainians are winning this war. So how do we balance this idea of nation being something that's old to something that's very, very strong as a mobilizational factor today?
Yeah, I mean, there is no contradiction there. I mean, nations are something created by humans, by the human mind. Nations are not like animals, like elephants, like giraffes that just exist in the world. They're something that we create. They can be something extremely positive. Nations, among other things, is the basis for having healthcare systems. I pay taxes to the Israeli nation, to the Israeli state, and it takes my money and build hospitals in a different part of the country, which I never visit. And still, I care about the people there. And this is the basis for giving them good healthcare. But what this example shows is that nations are not just, some abstraction that we should serve. Good nations serve their citizens. This is what they are for. They are not somewhere up in the sky. They are our sewage system. They are our schools. They are our hospitals. If you forget that, if you think that the nation is some kind of, like a mythical being that you need to serve and sacrifice your life for, then you get also things like the Russian soldiers, that they are told you have to fight for the glory of Russia, for the glory of the Russian nation, which is a completely abstract idea. I mean, how does it help the ordinary Russian citizen that the glory of Russia? It doesn't. Nations are a good thing when we remember that they are actually there in order to improve the lives of actual human beings. So it can be in terms of providing healthcare. It also sometimes during war in terms of protecting people from invasion, from conquest, from being enslaved to some foreign dictator. And in such situations, yes, people are often willing to even risk and sacrifice their life. And you say we sacrifice our life for the nation. But again, this is just an abstraction. What does it actually mean? It means that I'm willing to risk my life so that my compatriots, my neighbors, my family, also people I don't know on the other side of the country, I risk my life so that they would be free, so that they would have good education and good healthcare and all these things. So if we remember that, then it's perfectly compatible to understand that humans are the ones that create nations. They are just an abstract idea that we created, and that there are situations when it's worthwhile to fight for them and to risk our life for them.
Okay, well then I want to bring, if you don't mind, your first part of your the first answer that you had, which was had more to do with sort of the rules-based system of international politics.
Yes.
The idea of nation as something that is constructed and yet good, meaning it's a way of imagining a community, to use.
Yeah, maybe to give just one more example, something much simpler, like football. You know, everybody immediately would understand that football was invented by humans. It didn't come down from the sky. It didn't emerge from the laws of physics. We invented the laws of football. It doesn't mean that football is bad. I mean, if you use it, you know, for fun, to enjoy, for exercise, you often have loyalties to your football team. That's wonderful. If you forget it and you start, starting fights with hooligans, like you lost the game, so you start beating up the other fans, then you get carried away. This is not what football is for. So saying that something is constructed doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that we need to remember what it's for. It's ultimately in order to make human lives better.
Okay, well, obviously, one of the things that has happened at the moment is that the nation has mobilized a great many people in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And the mobilization has happened around these things that you were talking about in the first part, around this idea of freedom, this idea of being able to self-determine yourself, being able to live the way that you want to live, to speak the language that you want to speak, to be of the religious background that you want to be, etc. All of these things that have to do with freedom. Mm-hmm. Many in Ukraine are actually talking about the fact that Ukraine at the moment is at the forefront of, and you said this, at the forefront of the fight. And that is, when you start talking about forefront, we're talking about the Ukrainian Academy of Leadership. And so the question, I guess, it becomes, is there an opportunity for Ukraine, and is there a danger, perhaps, that you see, of us seeing ourselves as too much of a leader? In other words, starting to be, the too much of a leader means that you're not only living for yourself, but you're also trying to spread things. I think that the example of the United States is good here 200 years ago. Being a place from which freedom spread. Now the question is, does Ukraine perhaps have that kind of civilizational role in the future? Do you perhaps see that?
Yeah, absolutely. It is already happening. I think that Ukraine is now like a power station that kind of electrifies much of the world. People all over the world are looking up to the Ukrainians and in admiration, and also learning lessons from what's happening there. You see Europe uniting like it was unthinkable 3-4 months ago that Finland and Sweden would join NATO and would send weapons to Ukraine, that Switzerland would impose sanctions, that big oil corporations will pull out of investments out of Russia. And much of this happened because they were really, you see Ukrainians fighting with bare hands against Russian tanks, and you think, hey, I can also do something to try and better the situation. And I think on a deeper level, Ukraine provides some very important lessons for people all over the world. One very important lesson, which again has to do with nations and with nationalism, is that there is no contradiction between nationalism and liberalism. In the West, we have been in recent years in a culture war between left and right, liberals and conservatives, around this seeming contradiction that you have to choose. Are you a patriot or are you a liberal? And the Ukrainians are, I think, teaching the world that this is a false dichotomy. There is no contradiction there. They are fighting at the same time, both for their national independence and to build a free and liberal society. And nationalism and liberalism, very often in history, they actually go together because they have this common idea of liberty. And similarly, another main issue in the culture war in the West, in the supposed clash between nationalism and globalism, you have all these populist leaders telling that if you're a good patriot, you shouldn't be in favor of cooperation with foreigners and all these global institutions and the European Union and things like that. And again, Ukraine shows us that this is simply wrong. Nationalism is not about hating foreigners, it's about loving your compatriots. And there are many situations when the best way to take care of your compatriots is by cooperating with foreigners. So nobody can doubt the immense patriotism of the Ukrainians, and at the same time, they are fighting, one of your war aims is to join the European Union. So anybody who thinks that there is a contradiction between joining the European Union, being in the European Union, and being a good patriot should just take a look at Ukraine and learn that this is not so. And I hope, I think, that if people in Britain, in the United States, in other places around the world will look at what's happening in Ukraine and will learn these lessons, then one thing that could happen is that it will help to end the culture war within the West, which is tearing the Western civilization apart. And if we end this culture war, then really the West has nobody to fear in the world, because it's still the most powerful bloc politically, economically, culturally. You know, in terms of economics, the Russian economy is smaller than that of Italy. Russian economy before the war was $1.5 trillion. Italy is $1.9 trillion. The whole of the EU together, without Britain and the US, just the EU, is 15 trillion. So if the West ends the internal culture war and stands together, it has nothing to fear from Russia or from China or from any other entity in the world.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question because I think it's very important that your last answer pushes me towards another question, and I really do want to ask it. But I will say to all of the audience, if there's opportunities for you to be asking questions, and there will be opportunities, so please prepare your questions, and we'll give you an opportunity to ask them. In the answer to the last question that you gave, we talked about nation, and we talked about the culture wars, and we talked about the power of ideas on the one hand, and then you switched your answer into an economic, where you started to quote economic statistics. And I guess I'm confused as to what you've written a lot about the power of information. And of course, there are many people that have written about this sort of switch from, if you like, sensate or material culture towards an idealistic culture, and the power of ideas. And this is something that perhaps characterizes the current shift in civilization. I guess, where are we? Is it about economics today, or is it about nation and culture and ideas? What is the powerful force of movement, of progress at the moment?
Again, I mean, it's a false choice. It's about both, because the economy is about ideas. It's not just, in sense of the ideas of what do you want to buy or where do you want to invest your money. Money itself is just a cultural idea. And we learn it in the last few months. Putin has accumulated these hundreds of billions of dollars as a war chest, preparing for this war for years. And it was astounding to see how the financial system can just freeze this money. And it makes you think, what is money? I mean, he thought he had all this money, and apparently he doesn't. And this really kind of drives home the understanding that the economy is not an independent, objective field of activity out there, separate from culture, separate from philosophy, separate from the ideas in our minds. It's built on that. You cannot, money is an idea, banks are ideas in our minds, corporations are ideas in our minds. The rules that govern the economic system, they come from our minds, they don't come from physics or from biology or from mathematics. So changing what people think immediately also changes the economic system. So for instance, the information war have changed the way that big oil companies, or recently McDonald's, have thought about the idea of investing money in Russia. And they are pulling out. And this is extremely important. Similarly, it's with military power. Yes, in the end, you have bombs and missiles and tanks, but the decision to supply these weapons or not to supply them, it is influenced by cultural ideas. So there is no separation there. By changing, the ideas in the minds of people in Finland, you ultimately change the military balance of power on the ground, of how many tanks, how many airplanes belong to NATO or not.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. The power of ideas is something that I think we need to talk about a great deal more, particularly when we're very often we think that it's about economics and it's about military power. In fact, what the Ukrainians are showing today worldwide, I think, is the power of ideas, and that's something that I'm echoing what you have said, I think. If there are questions from our students, or if there are questions from the audience, we'd very much like to hear them. You have a unique chance of asking Yuval Harari some questions. Ulam Mikulayev, you've raised a hand. Please go ahead.
Hi, Professor Harari. All of us are so grateful to you being here. Thank you. And so, my question is, you said in the one interview and now about increasing military budget, in different countries. And so, will we see in the geopolitical area new economic leaders, actually? And the second question, it's about China. Mm-hmm. What the Russians' role for China? Why China support Russia? Thank you.
Okay, so focusing on the second question about China, it's extremely, again, one of the biggest impacts of this war could be to make Russia into a puppet state of China. The Russians are going on and on and on about how NATO is threatening them, how they're afraid of NATO, but there is no reason to be afraid of NATO. This is just Russian propaganda. I mean, which NATO member thinks about invading Russia? Do the Germans want to invade Russia? Do the French want to invade Russia? This is ridiculous. The real threat to Russia, in geopolitical terms, comes from the east, not from the west. East of the Ural Mountains, there are 30 or 40 million people, that's all, in Russia, and vast amounts of territory and resources and oil and gas and gold and whatever. And this is an extremely important area for China, for Chinese interests. And what is actually happening is that the Chinese are becoming the dominant power. I don't think they'll actually invade militarily, but they don't need to. As Russia becomes weak, becomes isolated, it becomes really a puppet state of China. And then whatever China says about the situation in Siberia, in the Russian Far East, in Central Asia, in Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, these places, Russia will not be able to resist. So it's, with all the kind of dreams of Putin's dreams about making Russia great again, he's turning it as a province of a Chinese empire. And this also has an impact on the second big Asian power, which is India, that traditionally, for decades, India and Russia were very close friends. And this is why also now India is kind of sitting on the fence and not condemning Russia, not taking any actions against it. Russia is the biggest weapon supplier for India. But if Russia gets too close to China and really becomes a Chinese puppet state, then this has far-reaching implications for India, because India's biggest fear is of a war with China. Now, if your biggest weapon supplier is Russia, but you're afraid of a war with China, and Russia becomes a Chinese puppet state, then you can't rely on it anymore. Because if there is a war, the Chinese will tell the Russians, stop providing weapons to India, and they can't resist them. So India also has to kind of recalculate its position and maybe get closer to the West because it can't rely on Russia anymore. So in this way, what Putin has done, it's actually drastically weakening the geopolitical position of Russia, not just in Europe with regard to NATO, but most importantly in Asia with regard to China and to India.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We're back to geopolitics, and this is going to be obviously a very multi-level discussion because we've gone from geopolitics to the power of ideas and nations and economics, and now we're back at geopolitics. Ivan, your question, please.
Thanks. So you raised a point about the inner conflict in Europe between the populists, the artificial conflict between the liberal and the national. Mm-hmm. My question is whether we're witnessing a global shift between civilizations. Joe Biden said during this week that he's witnessing the biggest challenge to democracy in the US ever. And my question is whether we're witnessing the shift in global powers, and whether the Europe will be able to pull back and gather its previous strength, or whether the new global powers will emerge and build a new world for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a couple of things. Again, the emergence of new powers is really inevitable. It's not necessarily bad. If Brazil, if India becomes new important players in the world, this is a positive development. We need a more inclusive world, which is not dominated just by the old empires. Of course, the big question is whether the new countries that join the leadership, they play a positive role or a negative role. And hopefully they would play a positive role, but we can't be sure, of course. With regard to the West itself, again, the West is still the most powerful bloc in the world. Its biggest danger is internal division, internal conflict. And here the situation is really worrying, especially in the United States. You see kind of the political temperature there increasing all the time, now also with Roe versus Wade, and the possibility that the Supreme Court will reverse its decision on that. And, you know, Democrats and Republicans now in the US, they are afraid of each other, and they sometimes hate each other more than they are afraid of anybody else in the world. In the Cold War, they were afraid the Russians will come to destroy our way of life. Now they think their neighbors across the street are trying to destroy their way of life, and a democracy cannot survive for long like this. If you think that the other people in your country are not your political rivals, but they are your enemies, you cannot have a democracy. Rivalry is fine. You think like this, I think like that, sometimes you win, sometimes I win, that's democracy, that's fine. But if I think you're my enemy, you are trying to destroy me, then you can have a civil war, or you can have a dictatorship. But you cannot have a democracy. I hope that the United States will pull back from the brink, and that also witnessing what's happening in Ukraine and the Putin's invasion would help to end or to kind of tone down this culture war in the United States. But Europe needs to be prepared. Europe cannot be complacent. Europe should understand it. Nobody knows what will happen in the United States. Nobody knows who would be the next president of the United States in 2024. Europe needs to be prepared to a situation when maybe the United States becomes absorbed in its own internal conflicts, becomes isolationist, and perhaps even becomes less democratic. And the EU would have to go it alone and become a more independent power in the world. And it should take serious steps in that direction as soon as possible, because we don't have much time.
Before I give the next question to Anton, if you don't mind, you were just talking about the fact that the role of Europe must be increased. I think that many of us see that as being a very much a possibility. The United States, with its culture wars, I would even call them identity wars, because it would seem to me that being a Democrat or a Republican in the United States is more important than being American.
Yes.
Which means it causes internal conflict, which is a threat to democracy. There are many questions that have come up prior to today's meeting and are coming up now in the chat about nuclear weapons. Europe does not have nuclear weapons, with the exception of, obviously, a very small arsenal in France and in Britain. We are always in the war in Ukraine, constantly looking at this threat of a nuclear strike, be it strategic, be it tactical, etc. I want to try to, again, we're moving constantly from this level of discourse and identity to geopolitics and back and forth, military, economic, and ideas, etc. But there's a very serious and real threat of usage of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on that? How do you see it? It obviously none of us are Putin's psychotherapists, so we don't know what's going on in that mind. But it would be interesting to hear your opinion on Europe's role in the future without having nuclear weapons against an enemy or a power that is very destructive with nuclear weapons.
I think we will actually see more discussions about it in Europe, maybe particularly in Germany, because a big question hanging in the air is, what do you think about Germany having nuclear weapons? Because again, in a kind of hypothetical but possible scenario, that in 2024, let's say Trump is president again, maybe next time in France, Le Pen becomes president of France. So on whose nuclear weapons are you relying to deter the Russians? On the nuclear weapons of Britain after Brexit? On the nuclear weapons of France headed by Le Pen? On the nuclear weapons with Trump, with his finger on the button? Or maybe Europe needs to think about other options. And like in many other fronts, when this war has caused people to think about the unthinkable, then these issues like German nuclear weapons, I think, will become far more relevant. And I'm not a European myself, so it's ultimately up to the Europeans to make a decision about these issues. But it's certainly the case that if for decades they just took it for granted that in a kind of deterrence against the Russian nuclear stockpile, they can always trust the USA, this is no longer the case.
Okay, thank you for that. Kirilo, you wanted to add a short question to this topic. Go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to have you. Yeah, basically what I'm trying to say, there's a great statement in your book about the nuclear weapons that's kind of the thing that holding the world from the actual nuclear war, as countries know there's not going to be like any winner. So the nuclear power is about the peace, not the war. But basically it's working right now that, like the possibility of Russia using the nuclear war is like held back because the UK may use the nuclear power against Russia. But on the other hand, like Russia is manipulated right now. That one of the reasons they held back the war, like they are still running it. So I mean, it's kind of funny because it happens now that the nuclear weapons is like holding back the nuclear war, but it's kind of the same that Russia is manipulating the nuclear weapons. Yes. So I just like to hear your thought about that.
Yeah, it's a complex situation. On the one hand, the nuclear weapons, they prevent direct war between the superpowers. On the other hand, they do give nuclear powers the ability to wage war, like now with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, without fearing of direct intervention by another power. If there were no nuclear weapons, there is a much higher chance that NATO, or at least some NATO members, would have already sent not just weapons, but actually troops to help Ukraine. But this is off the table because of the justified fear of a nuclear disaster, a nuclear Armageddon that could destroy the whole of human civilization. So it's kind of works both ways, and it has, again, sometimes good results and sometimes bad results. It's like that with most big things in history. They are never kind of 100% good or bad. What's happening now, though, is that we also see the rise of new kinds of destructive weapons, which actually make the danger even bigger. With the rise of artificial intelligence and the potential for autonomous weapon systems and the potential for cyber war, it makes the situation much, much more dangerous. With nuclear weapons, at least you had this clarity. It was like a rational chess game that if I use it, then you know that it's me who have used it and you'll retaliate and everybody will die, so let's not do it. But now increasingly, there is a danger of attacks that you don't know who is attacking you. And also you are never sure whether your weapons will actually work or not. So this could increase the temptation of one side to strike first because maybe the second side will not be able to retaliate. And also nuclear weapons, they are, it's all or nothing. This is why we didn't have a nuclear war since 1945. But cyber weapons, they can be used all the time. Like Israel and Iran are in a cyber war going on for years with attacks from both sides, but it's all kind of under the radar. So it actually enables you to conduct war clandestinely with complete or almost complete deniability of what is happening. So again, it has a good side because it means that you can take actions, maybe small actions, without the fear of kind of turning the whole world into a battlefield. But it also means that war could become far more widespread. We could reach a point when the whole world is like Israel and Iran in a constant cyber war. And which, again, it's not better, it's not worse, it's just a completely different world than the kind of world that we have been living in for the last few decades.
Thank you for that. I'm seeing questions come up, and I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask them. Anton, the floor is yours.
Hello. My name is Anton. I lived in Kiev, and I was listening to the podcast that you gave to TED Talks, and you say that we need to rebuild our new house and rebuild many institutions in that interview, in that podcast. And I want to ask you, what will be the values or what will be the base of the rebuilding institutions? And the second, my question will be about the food nationalism, because the Ukraine, the biggest country of the import of sunflower and sunflower oil at all, will stop it or like particularly stop, and India canceled their imports for a lot of countries. So what will be the future of food nationalism and that meaning at all? Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. It's an important question. Well, in recent decades, again, the world enjoyed a relative period of relative peace and prosperity. And also, we managed to kind of rein in, not completely abolish, but to control wars and epidemics and also famine. They went down and down. This was not some kind of miracle. This was the result of humans building good institutions, economic institutions, political institutions, which are based on the values on universal values, based on the idea that all humans share similar experiences, similar interests, similar values, and therefore it makes more sense to cooperate than to fight each other. Because we have, not maybe all, but some common interests and experiences, so it's easier to advance them if we cooperate than if we fight. This was the basic idea of the global order. And it worked to some extent. But then people started to neglect it. You know, like you build a dam over a river and you bring the river under control, but then you start to neglect the dam. Hey, we don't need it. The river is no longer dangerous. We control it. You neglect the dam, it starts deteriorating, there are cracks, you do nothing, and then it breaks down and there is a flood. So yes, we brought war and epidemics and famine under control because of global institutions, and then we neglected this, and the institutions crumble, and we have the war, and we have the pandemic of COVID, and we're now talking about world famine because of this food nationalism. And the best thing to do is to rebuild the institutions that, again, are based on this very simple understanding that we are all human beings. Nobody wants to go hungry. Nobody wants to die in war. All parents everywhere, they care about the future of their children. So it's easier to ensure food when countries cooperate than when they try to, because if countries start holding everything to themselves, then each country needs to produce everything. All the food, all the medicine, all the tools, all the computers, everything, and this is unworkable. It will lead to poverty, to greater violence, because it's just impossible to do that. So the best way is not just to go back to where we were, because the previous order was not perfect, is to build an even better and more cooperative global order. Again, it doesn't mean abolishing the nations or opening the borders to unlimited immigration or something like that. No, it means simply that you still have nation states as the basic political and economic units, but they agree on some common rules, like you can't invade and destroy countries just because you're more powerful. And these rules will be the basis for the global order. And I often give the example, the comparison of the Football World Cup, which we are going to have in a few months, of how this works. The World Cup is a competition between nations, and people have fierce loyalty to their national football team. At the same time, it's an exemplary case of global cooperation and harmony, because in order to have the competition, in order to have a football game, let's say between Ukraine and Brazil, you first have to agree on the same rules for the game. If one side says, hey, we can hold the ball in our hand, and the other side says, yes, and we can kick you in the stomach if we want to get through, you can't play football. So that's the model also for the world.
Yuval, if you don't mind, I'm going to sort of preface Markian's question, which is coming up in a moment.
Okay.
He's sort of, you talked about the idea of a rules-based order within the world, and you've compared it several times to a football game. Sometimes we need to sacrifice in order to build rules. That's different from football. Markian, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, thank you. So when you talked about patriotism, you said that it's right to fight for your country if it means improving quality of life of your fellow citizens. And quality of life is certainly an important aspect of our modern life. So my question is the West, and Germany in particular, ready to sacrifice their quality of life, dependence on fossil fuels, natural gas, and potentially go through a recession to help Ukraine win?
That's a good question. I don't know. We'll see in the coming weeks and months. I hope so. I think they also understand that they made a huge mistake in relying on fossil fuels in general and on Russian fossil fuel in particular. And they are now trying to rectify it, but it takes time. It's difficult. It's not something you can do kind of overnight. And as a historian, I know that we should never underestimate human stupidity. It's one of the most powerful forces in history. People often really do stupid things which are not in their best interests. But at the same time, we should also never lose hope in human wisdom. Because humans are sometimes, not always, but sometimes capable of making very wise decisions and making huge sacrifices. not for an immediate gain, but understanding where things will be in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years. What will happen in the specific case of European Union, specifically Germany, with this balance between Russian fossil fuels and the economic situation? I can't predict that. We'll see.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a group that we had one of our Ukrainian Leadership Academy centers was in Mariupol. And I think that city has now become a very well-known place, unfortunately, throughout the world. It's become legendary. So we've evacuated the students that were in Mariupol, but they are proudly signed on to this particular group today as Mariupol. So I'd like to give them an opportunity to ask a question. Go ahead. Please unmute.
Yep. Hello, I want to say at first big thank you for coming here. It really means a lot. And my question is related to institutions. So you said that we should change them and make them like better, but not try to uproot them from our system. And what I wanted to ask, what like first step we should do to make those changes? Because what we can see right now from different sources, which are, like countries who are very reliable on Russian sources, like gas, fuel, they're trying right now to save face of Putin. Like Macron and Scholz, they're trying to help him avoid big sanctions. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, it happened because they were reliable on those sources. And personally, I have feeling if war will end, they'll try to go back to the things as they were before. So what should we do to start those changes and to prevent staying in the same state it was before? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's very unlikely that the Europe or the world will just go back to where it was before. I think the eyes of the Europeans, most of them at least, have been opened by the tragedy of the last 3 months, and most specifically by the tragedy in Mariupol, which really kind of riveted the entire world watching how it unfolds. And I don't think that, I think the Europeans got a really, really big shock, both the populations and also the leaders, and they will not forget this shock so easily and just go back to business as usual afterwards. I do think that they still have hopes, and for good reason, not to completely abandon Russia or the Russian people. Again, I think with the Putin regime, I hope that they understand that no serious deals can be done. But this regime, sooner or later, will go to the basket of to the trash of history. And the Russian people will still be there. Russia as a country will still be there. And the best thing that could happen is if they change their type of regime, they change their aspirations, their behavior, and become a part of the European community, a positive part of the European community. And I think this will also be the best thing for Ukraine in the future, because they will still be there. I mean, they are not going anywhere. One of the worst things about this war is really, it goes back to what we said at the very beginning about ideas. That this war, it started as an idea, as a fantasy in the mind of a single person. It began as simply Putin's war. Not the war of the Russian people, not the war of the Russian nation, it's just Putin's war. But with each passing day, he is planting seeds of hatred, of violence in millions of minds. And it increasingly becoming a war of nations, a war of people. And the danger is that these seeds of hatred being planted right now, they will give terrible fruits of more hatred and more violence and more fears in years and decades in the future, long after Putin is dead. And that's the biggest danger. And we should maintain hope that this could be prevented. We should maintain hope. Again, it's not the situation right now, of course, but that sometime in the future, Russia could be reintegrated into the kind of human family of nations, of people that behave peacefully, that behave compassionately. And if it changes, then I hope that we can accept it with open arms, if and when this time comes. But until that happens, I think that things will not go back to how they were before.
I want to build on that little bit of inkling of optimism that you just gave us. And I want to move you back into your first love, and that is to be a historian.
Mm-hmm.
The general question that I will ask, and I'll ask you to try to bring it together with what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. How do wars change societies? It's very obvious that Ukrainian society is changing. It's very obvious that Russian society is changing. It's very obvious that the geopolitical maps of the world are changing and interests are changing. But I'd ask you to go back to your civilizational ideas. In other words, the fact that there is a movement of humanity, that humanity is evolving, if you like. Mm-hmm. What's the role of war, as terrible as it is? What's the positive story, if you might say, of civilizational evolution that we're undergoing at the moment?
You know, wars are a bad way of making changes, but they are a way of making changes. They change the world. And not always for the worse. People learn lessons from wars and change their behavior. Nations discover in themselves inner strength, inner abilities that they didn't even know that they had before that. So wars often forge nations. They forge alliances. They forge new cultures. The era of peace and prosperity, which I talked about earlier, to a large extent, this was a reaction to the terrible wars of the 20th century, and the realization that if we go on like this, then very soon humankind will destroy itself. And as a historian, one of the kind of most depressing things about the current war is the impression that we should have learned this lesson by now. And apparently not. You know, it's like going to school and learning a lesson and even taking an exam and getting a good result and coming the next day to school, the same lesson. I mean, what happened to humanity? Or certainly what happened to Europeans? They should have known better, but apparently not. You have to learn the lesson again. And a very big question is always, what is the lesson that you draw from a war or any kind of other terrible event? Like I take the example of my country, of Israel, and of the Jewish people. So with the Holocaust, there are two very different lessons that people took from the Holocaust. Some people took the lesson that this should never be allowed to happen again anywhere to anyone. And this was a foundation block for the new, more compassionate, more tolerant, more liberal order of the later 20th century and the early 21st century, of protecting the rights of minorities, of not allowing these kind of brutal totalitarian regimes to take over. But then other people, many people in my country, in Israel, they took a very different lesson from the Holocaust. They took the lesson that nobody cares about us, nobody came to help us in an hour of greatest need, so we shouldn't care about anybody else. We should only care about ourselves. The only thing that should interest us in any situation is only our interests. We don't have obligations for anybody else in the world. And you see it, for instance, now with the war in Ukraine, that Israel, even though it's part of the Western Bloc and an American ally, and lots of people in Israel coming from Ukrainian origins, it's sitting on the fence. It's very, very careful not to condemn Russia too much, not to send weapons to Ukraine, and to limit its involvement as far as possible, because it wants to protect its interest vis-a-vis Russia. For instance, we think if we give weapons to Ukraine, Russia would give more weapons to Syria and Iran. It's not good for us. So that's a very different lesson that can be taken. And again, I think it's a wrong lesson. I'm somewhat ashamed of the way that my country is behaving in this situation. And similarly, we talked a lot about nationalism before. So sometimes out of a war like this can emerge, again, these seeds of hatred, which are planted in the minds of people. They can create more hatred. So people come out of war full of hatred. Hatred of foreigners, hatred of minorities. They have this interpretation of nationalism as hating anybody who is not exactly like me. And again, you can have the opposite understanding, that this terrible thing is happening because of it began with the hatred in the minds of just a very few people, maybe just one person. So I should take care that I wouldn't be like Putin. I wouldn't have this kind of extreme nationalistic attitude that I hate foreigners, I hate minorities, I only care about my people. No, the lesson is the exact opposite, that real patriotism is about love, and that it doesn't mean that I need to be in conflict with anybody. Of course, if somebody attacks me, then yes, I defend myself, but I try as much as possible in the name of patriotism and nationalism to cultivate love and compassion and not hatred and fear.
Yuval, I want to thank you for that, because I think that one of the things, well, obviously I'm not as prolific a writer as you are, but one of the things that I try to get it across to our students and in my writing is this idea of civilizational progress happens when we have certain spots when civilizations progress. And war can sometimes be a very bad way of progressing, but nevertheless a way of progressing. Israel and Ukraine are very similar in many ways in terms of the history of Israel over the last 30, 40 years and what Ukraine has been experiencing today. And I think that these are two very interesting points of civilizational progress. Certainly Israel has a mission in civilization, and I believe that we in Ukraine are realizing also our mission. And I think that these two missions are very compatible. I want to thank you very much for joining us today. Unfortunately, we scheduled for 1 hour's worth of time, and not everyone was able to ask their questions. But I very much appreciate the fact that you were able to join us. I want to thank very much to our students at Ukrainian Leadership Academy for their questions and also for their initiative in actually making today's meeting happen. Thank you very much for your books. Thank you very much for everything that you're doing and for your support for Ukraine. We really believe that what is happening at the moment in Ukraine is atrocious, but there is actually something that is very positive for humanity that may come out of this. And we very much hope that message is something that can be spread also to the rest of the world. So thank you very much for your words today. If you have something final to say, please do. Yeah.
So thank you for inviting me. I think that, again, as I said, that the whole world is really watching with admiration the bravery of the Ukrainian people that are fighting not just for its own liberty, but really to protect what humankind has achieved. And the future of all of us depend to a large extent on you. I hope that people, that leaders, that other countries would do as much as they can to help you. And I hope very much to come in person when it's possible to a free, democratic, and prosperous Ukraine and meet you in person.
Thank you very much for that. We are propagating the idea that Kyiv is the capital of freedom, and we are very much hoping that we will be able to help welcome you in Kyiv and to our other beautiful cities also throughout Ukraine. Please come. The invitation is very much open. Thank you for everything you're doing, and thank you today for being with us. And to the Ukrainian Leadership Academy students, thank you for organizing this and for being here and for your leadership.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.